What's up, everyone? We're at Audioscape in Daytona Beach, Florida, and with Mr. Chris Yetter, the founder of Audioscape. And I thought what we could do today is talk about your optical compressors. So you have two.
Yes.
Let's give the guys like a rundown of what it means to be an optical compressor.
What does it mean to be an optical compressor?
Exactly.
So that's a question we all ponder, Joe.
Right. Don't we, though?
Don't we? An optical compressor, obviously, this uses an optical cell or what we call a T4B for the compression effect. So both of these devices use T4Bs. Obviously, the stereo uses two of them. Basically, what that is that's taking an EL panel, right? And as the light, there's a light in an EL panel, and as you start hitting it with more signal, it gets brighter. And what that does is it's inside of a dark enclosure like this. I guess I should just talk about it here.
That is a
T4B right there. It just sits in a tube socket, and it's housed in this dark thing because you don't want any light entering. So the only light you're going to get is from that EL panel, and then it's hitting two photocells. Much like you have photocells, if you have a motion sensor light, we all do, right? Mm-hmm, we walk by them, they turn on. Photoresistor, photocell, whatever you want to call it. Basically, that changes resistance with the light. And there's two of them. So maybe a good way to think is like you have an EL panel on the back of your phone or, some of the older phones or whatever, and it gets brighter and it shines this light on these two photocells. And one of them creates the compression effect. One of them is simply just for metering.
Okay.
So it's light's hitting them at both, different brightnesses of that light basically changes the compression effect and starts hitting this photocell, which in turn creates that gain reduction.
So how bright the light is how many decibels of reduction you're going to get. Okay.
So it's really cool. You can see if you actually, if you're testing them and if you look inside our test rig, where we make the T4Bs, you can see the light getting brighter with the increased signal. It's kind of cool to see in real time, like maybe if you're speaking into a mic or something like that, and you see that light get brighter. But that is a really, really ingenious way to create compression. Really, to think that up. And developed in the 50s, really released in the 60s with
Right. So that technology came into this.
Yes.
In the 60s, I believe. I don't remember the exact year, but
62-ish, I believe.
Okay. So early 60s is when this guy came out with that type of technology built into it.
And then, it's crazy.
Prior to then, it was the variable mute, the tube compression.
And, you think 60s, this still, yes, tubes are a thing in the 60s, but by the late 60s, you start getting solid state devices. So that's why you see between 7 years or so, you start seeing the LA3. And then, of course, people start throwing this thing out thinking it's old and obsolete.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Makes you cry inside. But
so the tube that's in here, whereas we had done a variable mute show about your variable mute compressors and how they work. So this is tube based as well, but it's not for the compression.
Yeah,
correct.
Well, actually, the compression has. I'm glad you asked that. So there's a good way to look at the 2A is you have, line amplifier or gain, the gain staging. This is its own output amp, makeup amp, whatever you want to call it. I think it confuses people because it's on the left side.
Usually have input, output. Right,
they think these two things are interactive, and they are in the sense that, if you start getting a lot of compression, you're going to need makeup gain. That's the extent of it. So there's actually two tubes that control that makeup gain amplifier, a 12AX7 and a 12BH7. So your input tube, you have a 12AX7 input tube here. And then you have a 12BH7 output tube. This is essentially the audio you hear. So God forbid, you start getting some bad distortion or things sound thin. You may have a tube dying, right? And it could be, depending on the problem, it could be one of these two tubes. So if you hear the problem and something's going on, or if you have a lot of noise and hiss, and this is one of the things we do, we actually have to tube roll. We have to select this first position tube in particular for the lowest noise, lowest hum, lowest hiss, no microphonics, super sensitive. This tube right here is the first thing that signal hits, right? So it's extremely important. Then in the side chain, it's actually tube controlled as well.
This?
Yeah, the side chain, the compression section, I call it the side chain amp or whatever. That uses a 12AX7 and a 6AQ5. So you notice, the 2A has 4 tubes in it. So these are what these tubes are doing. So these two tubes are controlling the compression section. And this in particular is what's sending signal to that panel, this 6AQ5 tube. It's a squash tube. It's extremely important. They don't make new production of these, but there is a lot of new stock ones here in the US, and we're able to get them, by the hundreds, thousands with no issues, luckily. But yeah, extremely important to the compression effect. And this is actually one of the things we tube roll as well, where we have to listen, crank the snot out of the side chain. To it's got to fall apart and get that rubber band effect just right. And this tube is important for that. This tube, not so much, but you should be surprised. Sometimes I'm like, I've rolled 50 of these tubes, and then it's just this tube, right? This 12AX7, which is extremely important in the side chain as well. And I know you were talking about this. This is actually a limit sensitivity control. And this is one of the most misunderstood controls on this device, because people think it's just a simple sidechain high pass, and it's actually a limit sensitivity. So what happens is when it's all the way clockwise here, and this was originally on the back panel and just fixed for whatever setting for broadcast.
That's really about the only modification you made, is moving this to the front panel for the user, which we want. We can actually reach it now.
Yes, you can reach it, right? And so right now, when it's set all the way fully clockwise, the compression, it's telling the sidechain to just basically target all the full frequency range, right? And as you start turning it counterclockwise, you start telling the compression to start targeting higher frequencies, higher and higher, as you start turning it counterclockwise. And then you can kind of get almost like a de-essing kind of effect when it's fully counterclockwise. And you'll notice you'll see the reaction on the meter. It'll start compressing a lot less. So
I'm glad you brought this up, because this is a conversation I have sometimes with bass player friends of mine. So you'll have bass players that sometimes have an original Teletronics, or work in a studio or two that have an original Teletronics, and they get used to the certain grab that it has, right? And so they will get an Audioscape or something. They'll get if they think it feels different than what they're used to, it's because this is it. This is it. If they think it's grabbing more or grabbing less, they'll call me. So, I've had them call me before, and I'm like, just turn that knob until you get what you're, it's like, there it is. That's the one. And just leave it.
And they're all different. And one thing that's not talked about often too is there is a stereo adjust trim pot, and that controls the amount of compression, overall compression as well. We like to run it wide open. We like to we're loud and proud as far as crank the snot out of it. You know what I mean? As far as being able to get as much as you want. But if you do want to dial back the overall compression, we encourage folks. Sometimes they do feel it's too grabby overall. You can just tweak that back a little bit. And that's one of the other settings. But it's such a lovely compressor. Obviously, everything you put through it sounds better.
It's warm. It's thick.
Yeah, it's thick. It's warm. And, what's funny is, yes, these use both the same gain reduction element, but, the gain reduction element, the T4B in here, they typically, a little bit slightly faster attack release times. In these by design.
The 3A versus the 2A.
Yes. And that's some things that they wanted to, I don't want to use the word improve, but they wanted to do different, I guess.
They may have thought it was an improvement in that era.
Yes.
Now we see both flavors as I got to have them both.
Yeah. They're both holy grail compressors, obviously, for good reason. So what's great about these, and obviously they were half racks that people would put together. We found it more useful to put them together in one case and have a stereo.
Thank you. I hate the half rack space.
I am not a fan of the half rack as well. If there's a vintage one though, and the half rack's bothering you, we'll take it.
That's exactly right. Most tracking rooms that when I move around like I do, they always have them in pairs. Which is great, because this could be really useful on. I have a pair. I should mention you have this available. Essentially the same product in a 500 series module. So I have 2 of your 500 series modules, for example, and I will sometimes put those on a guitar subgroup to just tickle it a little bit and get that mid-forward sound that these are known for. So we were mentioning that I call it warm and rich. Some people think they're dark or darker than some other pieces, whereas when they moved forward in time to the solid state circuit, it became some people would call it brighter. I don't think they're bright though, but they do have a mid-forward presence.
Perfect. That's exactly how I would describe it. Very mid-forward. And anything that lives and in addition to, like I mentioned, the little bit slightly faster attack release, well, that mid-forward sound mixed with being able to handle those bigger transients of like the attack on a piano really made it useful for those mid-range instruments in general. And even people can even use them, on some of their faster ones on drums, which you don't really think about this on drums, right? Yeah. Because we've all experienced it. I don't want to say it's a limitation of this, but if something's got a big attack, it's not going to grab it. It's slower, right? So it's not going to grab it as well as something like this. So, that's why you see people recommend as the best vocal chain of all time, a 2A into a 76 style compressor, right? Because you're going to grab those fast peaks with the 76 and then you're going to smooth it out with this, or vice versa, however you want to do it. There is no, in my opinion, that's a preference, with what goes into what. But yeah.
I will say, for, two names that all our viewers are going to know. Chris Lord-Alge, for example, uses these really prominently on electric guitars.
Oh, yeah.
Because of that mid-forward. So even if you're not moving the meter at all or barely moving the meter, because you don't, maybe not really wanting compression, the mid-forward bite that it adds to the, the upper mids of the guitar is a very pleasing thing. So they would patch, not just him. He's just an example of one of our heroes that would do that kind of a thing. So they would use this box as an enhancement tool, not just a compression tool. And another, my Michael Jordan, Bob Clearmountain, he calls these on lead vocals. He uses two compressors. He uses an LA3A or an 1178, and generally not both of them, but one or the other. He calls these a cheat box. It's just like it's so smooth, and I can get so much reduction. There's, it's like I feel like I'm cheating when I use the LA3 because it works so good.
It really does, yeah. And what's interesting is, it's solid state, so it's transistorized, and it's really interesting how much R&D went into this, and the fact of how they did that in general. And one of the challenges they had to overcome is, how do we light up the EL panel that we we're just talking about in this? So this still has that, and it requires a higher voltage than what the solid state, what everything else runs on, right? The amplifier circuitry, all that. So there's actually an additional transformer in this design on each channel called the autoformer. And what this does is this takes that signal and it steps it up. So now, cause that EL panel, you can, want like 105 volts AC on that, right? And you're not getting that with this, running on 24 volt or whatever it is. So it takes that signal and it steps it up. It goes through that transformer, and that's what lights the panel. So they had to overcome that and figure that out. And there were other companies besides, obviously, Teletronics making the optical compressors. I've even ran into some old R&D projects from RCA.
Oh, wow.
I found one. I was just looking. It had a T4 built in a different way, not in this enclosure, right? It was built just in a little shell inside on this thing, and it was using. They were using the output transformer. I don't want to divert too much, but it was using the output transformer from the LA2A as the autoformer, as the driver. And they were trying all these, so all these in-house studios, they had their own versions of these optical things, these Varimuse, like we were talking about sometimes. And, that's something I don't think people, they look back on. Studios, built their own gear, and they had their own departments that did that. And it was really cool. I still have that piece of history. I traced the schematic, and there are some similarities, but it was before this came out. So they were already trying to take that optical design and transistorize
Speed it up, make it quieter, whatever the case may be. Yeah.
So, it's really interesting.
You mentioned the word transformer, and this is, okay, so you have a broad product line. So I'm looking at, passive style EQs.
Yeah.
The iron, the transformers are a huge part of that. Yeah. I'm seeing your 6A, your variable mute compressors, iron. I mean, we think of the tubes, of course, in both of those, tube gear, but the iron is going to be really important.
Yeah.
But now we also have transformers here. So I'm assuming that, historic accuracy, I know how important that is to you. So, tell us about the iron that would be in this guy.
So, what's interesting is back then they actually used, especially the later Silver 2As, used mic input transformers from UTC. So you don't think it is not technically, So the A10s were used later on. Obviously the HA100Xs were used early on. And some
you brought up a good point. There were 3 variations of this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. There was the silver, the gray, and then the original, what they call it LA2. Not an LA2.
Oh yeah,
so there's a
very different. Yeah. And there are variations for sure. And that's the thing I don't think is discussed enough. People think of things as just being fixed. And we were talking about this the other day. You want to know what a vintage LA2A sounds like? Well, to get a conclusive answer, you need at least probably 10 of them.
Yeah, and come up with an average vibe.
Yeah, because it does vary. There are some serious variances with everything, and they were definitely very slow. A lot of the old ones in particular.
Yeah. I've experienced very noticeable tonal differences in the high frequencies, in vintage ones at studios in Nashville where there's 2 of them. A lot of studios have 2. That's kind of a magic number. One would be the one to go to for certain things and not the other one. They're both great. It's not that either one of them suck. It's just that manufacturing tolerances were so different back then.
They were so wide.
And you can get things so tight and accurate now. They couldn't.
Yeah. And well, one thing we do is we decide where we're going to keep that variance. And I feel like we do, very true to the original, keep a lot of variance. And one thing they have even trimmer capacitors in here. One of those trimmer capacitors could have been set to a different range and, affecting the high range on that one unit versus the other. Or there's just so many other factors, like those carbon compositors could have drifted way up, which I'm sure they do. They drift up over time. You could have, so the whole unit may be so far out of tolerance, it's just going to tonally change.
Yeah.
And that's what's so hard about that. So trying to just build them like they did with the parts they did back then, it's kind of like getting that sort of fresh off the line, like that old one, like when it's almost like buying something from 1965 or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, got it. The optical cell, the T4B, the original, doesn't exist. I mean, I'm sure the original manufacturer of it is.
Well, the original they manufactured them themselves as well.
Yeah.
Is what they did, back then. And cadmium, was used in them as well, which is, one of those things that manufacturers have had a hard time finding substitutes for modern day. And so that is used in the, the materials for these as well.
So you are, as there's no secret to anyone watching or yourself, are not the only one that tries to recreate this, including, like, for example, this is off the market. That you can't get this from the original Teletronics. It doesn't exist anymore. You can still get this or from other people, but you have you use your own photocell.
Yes,
right.
We use our own T4Bs. We make them here on site. And I was describing this earlier. The reason I did that is I know there's a couple actual, companies that manufacture T4Bs nowadays. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those ones that I found were just, especially in 2017 when we were doing this, were made like what I call the JBL era of T4Bs, where they have a cap coming off one of the pins. And all the old T4As, T4Bs I opened from the 60s have carbon comp resistor, half watt strapped across the EL panel. And that's just the way they were made. Every single one. And I used to repair them and just refurbish them and sell them. And usually it's the EL panel that dies in those. But the photocells are usually good for, a long, long time. And so I was like, why, I just started building them and figuring out how to build them and test the photocells properly for matching, all that whole process, build a custom jig, figure out, how to flash them just right, all that. So you can properly calculate the range of their release and attack. So that's what we started doing. And that was a big part of the dev process of this because, without that, we couldn't do this.
That's the sound of that is the unit. Right?
So I liked what ours sounded more accurate doing them that way, even before I started testing all those parameters and getting like the ranges on that, like I was talking about, even just building it like that sounded more accurate just right from the jump without even doing that. So, and it's just a simple thing. And that's a lot of this stuff. I feel like we, especially engineers, they over-engineer things. They think about things too much as far as like, and maybe it's a way to save money. I don't know. I'm not in their heads, but to me, it's just like, it's simple. Like the answers to a lot of these things are simple. Oh, well, they use this. Well, let's just go find that.
Right.
Oh, not just say, oh, we can't make this because we can't find it in a decent quantity nowadays. And that's what I feel like sometimes the mentality is. And if you can, I'd rather make 100 of something the right way instead of like 1,000 of something with a watered down version of it.
Okay, gotcha.
Let's just put it that way.
Something I use an LA2A on, I wish I could remember. It's one of our heroes that we would have idolized 20 years ago. I think he's passed away now, but I was reading an article and he was saying on recording days that his secret kick drum thing was putting these on kick drum. And I thought, an LA2A, are you kidding me? Went into a studio to track the next day that has 2 LA2, not the next day, but the very, and I put it on the kick drum. Unbelievable. The slow attack lets the transient come through. The slow release, here's the key. The slow release, it doesn't fully release before the next kick drum hits. So all of a sudden you get a very linear thing.
Yeah.
But you get the beef of the tube and the transformer that's in this for that low end thing. Unbelievable kick drum compressor. That's a little secret, little tip. That's my go-to now.
Wow.
On tracking days on kick drum. I don't use it on the mix, but after anything after that initial kick drum hit is perfection.
I think you just touched on something there that, a lot of times, we don't talk about enough is using it with tracking, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like obviously excellent mixing tools, but it is different. There's something very different about using this on the way in and just committing.
Oh,
and
yes.
Yeah, it's a whole different, I feel like we talk about it enough, but we don't.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like you really can't emphasize how much of a difference there is and how useful they are during the tracking phase.
To me, the tubes and real transformers, great mics in the great place, the great location on the instrument is everything.
Yeah.
That is 80% of my album right there is going through great transformers, not emulations. I can do that in the mix. If I use it on the front end, my mix can survive emulations, but, I don't want all emulations from the beginning to the end. I want to go through real stuff. I've heard the difference. I'm a believer, but, well, thanks for taking a minute out of your day to show us, these tools and, talk about them. How about if I put them on the rack back here and we start dialing them in and listening to them?
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks, Joe.
All right, let's take a listen. So we have the 2A and the 3. So let's start with the 2A on a female vocal that is, it's kind of soft, but she pushes here and there, and there's definitely some dynamic shifts. Let me just play it for you.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Okay, so we get that into a track, and we're going to need a lot more consistency. So you're already hearing the tone of the unit. So now let's start dialing up the peak reduction and get some compression going.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold. If I try, then I need to know if you, my love, would ever let go. Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Okay, so we're knocking down 5 to 7 dB of volume in total. So now when she says be bold at the end of that line, that can be much louder than it was going to be otherwise, because the differences between our loud and our quiet have been reduced by 7 decibels, which is significant. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to change that over to the 3A, and you're going to hear an immediate tonal shift. So the warmth and the fullness that was being added in her voice by the 2A, now when we move up to the 3A, and you're going to hear a much more biting, mid-range, forward, leaner tone. Check this out.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold. If I try, then I need to know.
One more time here, and I'm getting it dialed in.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold. If I try, then I need to know if you, my love, would ever let.
So you hear that it's faster. You hear that it's releasing faster, so it's not quite as creamy on the release as what the 2A is at the same 5 to 7 dB of reduction. However, we can use that to our advantage on other sources where we want it to get out of the way faster. Sometimes what I do mixing-wise, I'll make my decision to go between these two based on the pacing of the words, the tempo of the song. You know, how are they dictating the lyrics? Is it fast and punchy, or is it a ballad with a lot of long words being enunciated slowly? And so I can choose between the two based on that. Another really cool use for the solid state side of optical compressors, as the DA3A is electric guitars. And that's because, as we discussed earlier, the tone of the unit is different. It's a little bit mid-forward, so it adds a little bit of presence, a little bite, a little cut, whatever we want to call it, in the upper mids, which really works for guitars. So I've got this linked, and so what we'll do is let's give them a listen. Let's see, let's set them around the same here. So now we're already hearing that mid-forward thing, but let's add a touch of compression. So that's a really cool use for this tool, is to just let it be it and make the guitars pop, but at the same time, you can put just a little squish on them. A lot of times, just barely moving the meter between 1 and 2 dB can really make a difference within the mix. Another cool thing for the 3A type circuit is useful that it really wasn't on the 2A is pianos, because it's faster attack. And also, the fact that it adds a little presence, a little bite is not a bad thing at all. So let's kind of, let's just hear it in action. So I have it in, yes, I do. Let's dial in some reduction. So we're getting what, 4 dB? Really about 5 dB on that one note. So, but you still hear the transient. So its attack time just somehow works with the percussiveness of a piano, whereas this guy does not. But what's everything great about the way this handles transients on a piano, and sometimes even on, I've seen people use them on drum rooms. They sound great sometimes on acoustic guitars, is what makes this thing really cool on bass guitars. Bass guitar has a different type of transient, and of course that long sustain. Remember, LA2A slow release. So check this out. No, this is no compression, but of course we're getting the fullness. Bass players love the tone of a 2A. You patch that in them and they're gonna be happy. All right, check it out. So it's not taking much, because I believe this is probably a really, really hot source, because this is really low for the reduction knob. But nonetheless, let's hear like 3 to 5 dB. That slow release is doing its thing, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes I have friends that are bass players get a hardware piece of it, whether it's a vintage Teletronics, a reissue from UA, Audioscape, or anything else. They're like, man, it doesn't feel quite right. This knob right here, some people call it preemphasis, adjusts how it reacts to low frequency. So sometimes whatever they're used to, they may not even know what they're used to on the one that they're used to, because it was on the back panel, blah, blah, blah. That says, watch how this changes the way it reacts. Remember how we were getting 5 dB of compression? Now we're saying don't respond so much to the real low stuff, and all of a sudden it's reacting differently. So we'll use a lot more peak reduction, but you'll hear how different it's reacting because it's focusing more on upper frequencies. Check this out. And of course, if we want to go pretty much just attack. So it sounds a little more percussive. So you can really change the way the unit reacts with this knob right here. So I really recommend playing with that. If you're buying the hardware and you're a bass player and you're really looking for the magic, play with that and you'll find your magic sweet spot between the way it's attacking the percussive nature of the guitar versus the sustain. That's a really valuable tool. But anyway, that's just a quick sneak peek of the DA3A as well as the Opto Compressor.